Welcome to Ruth section 5. We have one more section after this, section 6, just to summarise it all, but this is section 5. And in this, we're going to consider part of Ruth chapter 3, because there are only 4 chapters in Ruth. And I want to read to you verses 7 to 11 of Ruth chapter 3. And in here we read, "When Boaz had finished eating and drinking and was in good spirits, he went over to lie down at the far end of the grain pile. Ruth approached quietly, uncovered his feet, and lay down. In the middle of the night something startled the man, and he turned and discovered a woman lying at his feet. 'Who are you?' he asked. 'I am your servant Ruth,' she said. 'Spread the corner of your garment over me, since you are kinsman redeemer.' 'The Lord bless you, my daughter,' he replied. 'This kindness is greater than that which you showed earlier. You have not run after the young men, whether rich or poor. And now, my daughter, don't be afraid. I will do for you all you ask. All my fellow townsmen know that you are a woman of noble character.'" Is there anything, do you think, that it's worth risking your reputation for? Ruth obviously thought Boaz was well worth the risk. The meeting on the threshing floor could undermine the good reputation that Ruth had earned for herself since her arrival in Bethlehem. To meet a man in secrecy, in the night, and then lie down with him is not acceptable behaviour. These verses are full of ambiguity, mystery, and intrigue. It seems as if the writer is at pains to keep the details of this encounter to a minimum, so that its central elements remain plain. Ruth follows up Naomi's instructions with action, and in verse 19, where Boaz asks, "Who are you?" marks a break with the instructions Naomi give to Ruth, and here she has to use her own initiative as she responds to Boaz's question about her identity. His question contrasts with the earlier question in chapter 2, verse 5, where it says, "Whose young woman is that?" Now Boaz is more direct. Ruth gave her name and her status. She is still restrained, though, but now she is bold enough to say that she is Boaz's servant, without the qualification she felt obliged to add in chapter 2, verse 13. But here in chapter 3, she discards all restraint when she says, "Spread the corner of the garment over me, since you are a kinsman redeemer." Her request has 3 implications. First, it implies that Ruth recognizes her own need for protection. The word for corner is the same as for wing, used in chapter 2, verse 12. "May you be richly rewarded by the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge." Remember, it's the same word. The corner of the garment is the same word that's used for wings. In other words, Ruth asks Boaz to be the answer to his own prayer for her safety. So Ruth's asking Boaz to be the answer to her own prayer. When we sometimes pray and we ask, "Oh God, please do something, get something changed," maybe God's saying, "Well, yes, I will, but you do it." We have to be ready for that. Secondly, it was customary for a widow's relative to claim the right to marry her by covering her with a garment. If Ruth had this in mind, as Boaz's response suggests he did rather, then she is asking Boaz for his hand in marriage. Thirdly, Ruth makes her request because Boaz is her kinsman redeemer. What she does is not improper or immoral, but justified. She shows respect for the law about kinsman redeemer, but in fact goes beyond the requirements of the law, which is actually to redeem land, by also redeeming Ruth herself by meeting her need for a husband. Ruth's words are few, but their significance is great. She says nothing else to Boaz, but humbly submits to his instructions. The theme of Ruth's noble character is picked up in verse 11, where we read, "And now, my daughter, don't be afraid. I will do for you all you ask. All my fellow townsmen know that you're a woman of noble character." Her actions, though, have risked her reputation, but Boaz reassures her that nothing is lost. The Hebrew word translated as noble character is used to describe Boaz in chapter 2, verse 1, where it says, "of standing." The word means strength of character, so the writer is saying that Boaz's strength of character is matched by Ruth's own. In other words, these two truly deserve each other. Despite the age gap, this is an ideal match. And I say the age gap because Boaz is probably, we're not terribly sure, but he's probably 10 or 20 years older than Ruth. So there's a bit of an age gap there. The tense scene ends with a practical gift. And we get that in verse 15. He also said, this is Boaz speaking, he also said, "Bring me the shawl you are wearing and hold it out." When she did so, he poured into it 6 measures of barley and put it on her. Then he went back to town. 6 measures of barley. That's a lot of barley. So he gave her all that, and that met her needs, but it also met Naomi's needs. Naomi wasn't forgotten. She's not mentioned, but she's not forgotten. So to his positive response and promise, Boaz adds a large gift of barley. In so doing, he meets Ruth's short-term needs as well as her long-term ones. It shows us too that Naomi's needs have not, as I've said, have not been forgotten. The further act of kindness which concludes this scene helps the reader to anticipate Ruth's blessed future, which will end her days of emptiness. This unconventional event has not destroyed reputations, but has enhanced them. Boaz now goes back to town to make the necessary arrangements. And a lot more about that in the next section. Naomi's advice to Ruth to wait is her last recorded utterance. The women have played their part, and Boaz takes charge from here on in. No more words of Ruth are recorded either. Naomi knows that both she and Ruth can sit tight and wait. She is confident that their kinsman redeemer will settle everything straight away. As we've discovered in these first 3 chapters, Ruth finds her kinsman redeemer to be older than she is. Ruth has been married before, and of course her husband died in chapter 1. But you know, we don't know about Boaz. He may or may not have been married, but nevertheless, the two are drawn together, and we'll have to wait until the next section to find out where this leads us to. But we do know from the previous section that it must lead to marriage, because Boaz and Ruth have a son whom they call Obed, who is in relation to King David, King Solomon, and also to King Jesus. So it's quite an important match. And I think it's important to think about and reflect on. Ruth is a Moabite. She is excluded from Israel. That's the way it was in those days. But yet, here is God working in her life and drawing her in. I think that says a lot about God. God offers hope to all people, even the ones we don't like. So he offers hope to all people. And surely our job is to reflect that. We have to provide hope for all people. So thank you for listening to section 5. Section 6 will appear in a couple of days. I hope you've enjoyed it, and I hope you've read Ruth, the book of Ruth, all 4 chapters, because it's really, really interesting. And don't just read it once, read it 2 or 3 times. It only takes 10 minutes. But read it through and enjoy it. Thank you for listening.